LA Noire is almost the game that I've always wanted. Detective stories dominate film and TV, with some of the most critically acclaimed and influential hits of all time featuring the police procedural. It's a genre that has sprawled to a degree unlike maybe any other, from classic black and white film noir like The Big Combo, classic color noir Chinatown, sci-fi noir Blade Runner, neo-noir action LA Confidential, and contemporary realistic television noir like The Wire and True Detective. It can be used both as a vehicle to tell a more personal, character-driven story, or as a story in itself. The 1974 classic film Chinatown is a traditional hard-boiled detective story on the surface, about the corrupting influences of the rich and powerful, and a scrappy outsider getting involved in something he's not supposed to. But at its core, it's a character-driven story about the inevitable tragedy of your past.
Forget it, Jake. It's Chinatown.
Modern TV classic The Wire instead is a story almost entirely about the logistics of the police procedural and the corruption of the city. It's both a scathing critique of the drug war, politicians, school boards, unions, newspapers, and a steadfast, enthusiastic champion for long-term investigative police work. The detective story, or the police procedural, is a storytelling trope that has range and power to explore a wide variety of topics and moods, and has been a part of so many important historical moments in those mediums. So why is it that when you search for detective video games on your search engine of choice, what comes back is a collection of misfitting retrofitted titles that don't represent the genre in the same way it does for film and TV? The detective story has been famously hard to adapt to video games. How do you make a game, in the traditional sense, with fail states and escalating challenge out of something that essentially boils down to three things: inspecting crime scenes, interviewing witnesses, and charging a suspect? Most games either haven't tried or present detective mechanics as window dressing, where it presents the appearance of detective work but doesn't fully commit mechanically and solves everything for the player instead of creating a compelling challenge out of it. LA Noire is no hyperbole, the single bravest and most ambitious game that I have ever played. It's so ambitious that it's downright cavalier and reckless, but so lovable because of it. It tries to make an open-world AAA experience in both a totally unexplored setting and create a whole genre with a massive budget and sales expectations that a AAA publisher requires. I'm amazed that this project even got off the ground, but LA Noire does it with such winning charisma and enthusiasm that they just about pulled it off on their first go. It is the first game that I'm aware of that has fully systemized and put into understandable video game mechanics the procedures of detective work. Not modern detective work, which is aided immeasurably by forensic scientists and lab techs, but the classic noir school of a one- or two-man investigation, from everything to inspecting crime scenes for evidence, interviewing witnesses, and charging a suspect. Crime scene investigation plays a big part in LA Noire, and I'm both astonished and grateful that it remains the only game to get it mostly right. Investigation has become something of a staple in action games over the past few years, from the detective vision in Batman Arkham to the Witcher senses in Witcher 3, but it's always been very underdeveloped and a very minor part of these games. All it really consists of is using your magic vision to guide you to hit the interact key on an obviously highlighted object, and then have Batman or Geralt solve everything for you in dialogue. It's an illusion of crime scene investigation. You don't actually do anything besides press a couple buttons. It doesn't actually require any problem solving from the player. Now, that's mostly okay, because that's never really been the main focus of these games, but it's always stood out as being shallow, because it stands in the shadow of LA Noire. In LA Noire, Cole Phelps, the player character, doesn't possess any kind of heightened senses or X-ray vision. To inspect a crime scene, the player has to sift through all the evidence themselves, carefully, methodically. The first obvious question is, that sounds like it could be obnoxiously repetitive. It could get tedious picking up 50 empty beer bottles with no purpose at all, with the 51st having some investigation critical message inside. What LA Noire does is it reduces the amount of investigatable objects in a crime scene to something manageable. Whenever Cole nears an interactable object, you will hear a chime play. Pick it up, and if you hear another chime, then it can be investigated further. No chime or prompt, and it isn't anything pertinent. It's very efficient and doesn't disrupt the pacing. I think it's appropriate for more nebulous evidence, but for written documents that support Cole's case, it is a little unfortunate that Cole will voice out exactly how the document fits his case, instead of letting the player read it and figure it out for themselves. It's surprisingly easy to miss something in this system with no evidence highlighted and a relatively loose crime scene boundary, and that's exactly the way it should be. While it is unfortunate that the game holds the player's hand in identifying evidence, this is all purposeful and reinforcing LA Noire's most ambitious and notable achievement, using that evidence in its groundbreaking and captivating interrogation system. LA Noire's system of interrogating witnesses is its defining feature, and one that took a fundamental reworking of video game presentation to achieve, one that remains influential to this day. LA Noire released in 2011. At this point in video game presentation, it had advanced to a point where graphical fidelity and resolution were at least relatively comparable to something that could be perceived as believable, given a fair amount of suspension of disbelief at least. It wasn't like just a few years prior where character models remained a cryptic, blocky mess of parts with no definition. Arms looked like arms, legs looked like legs, and faces looked like faces, as long as they weren't moving. This was video games' Achilles heel in presentation. For cinematic games in particular, faces in close-up did not look anywhere near believable in 90+% of games. The reason for this is because faces were animated by hand with a computer. Often they would use an actual human actor's face for the model, but all acting was done in a sound booth with voice only and then animated later by hand. LA Noire is the first game, outside of full-motion video adventure games, to do no manual animation. They developed a revolutionary camera scanning system with 32 cameras surrounding an actor while they perform their lines. It's able to capture every bit of detail and nuance in an actor's performance that film or TV can, without looking like spliced together film footage into a video game engine. It's still animated, just not by hand. It's captured on film and then converted into LA Noire's engine to look natural. The result is by far the most realistic character faces ever seen in a video game at its release. You can actually see subtle details like half smirks or muscles tightening in anger without something more obvious like a frown. It was absolutely stunning at the time and still holds up to comparable technology today. The only problem is that because this technology was pretty far ahead of its time, the rest of the textures aren't really on the same level, with some downright awful looking hair that creates an uncanny valley effect if you stay vigilant on spotting poor texture work. Clothes actually look really good, especially considering this game came out in 2011, and body animation is above average for the time as well. It's just the hair for some reason that has shockingly low definition and no articulation. With some moderate suspension of disbelief, it's not so bad, but pay too much attention and you can mistake LA Noire's characters for robots with hijacked human faces. Mostly stellar presentation aside, the real reason this motion capture system was developed is so that it can work mechanically, and I still can't believe that I am saying that facial expressions are a mechanic in a video game. How it works is that after gathering evidence at a crime scene, Cole will need to interrogate witnesses or suspects to gather further information. This isn't just a cutscene. You as the player have to study the witnesses' expressions and demeanor to determine if they are lying or not. You have 3 options as a response: truth, doubt, and lie. Truth and doubt are pretty straightforward. If they seem relatively trustworthy, then pick truth, and if they seem untrustworthy, then pick doubt. Accusing a suspect of lying is more complicated because you need evidence for the accusation to ring true. Determining if a suspect is lying or not isn't actually that challenging most of the time. The motion capture system developed here allows actors to indicate to the player that they are lying with their facial expressions. The acting is inconsistent. Some of the time it can be a little tricky with subtle motions like shifting eyes and avoiding eye contact, but other times the lying is so obvious that it just comes off as funny. Now, some have poked fun at some of the more exaggerated expressions in the game, and this is true. Some actors are way too over the top, but most of these clips you'll see on the internet are taken out of context and don't reflect the actual playing of the game. Once again, in a sentence I can't believe I'm writing without irony, Noire has a fucking difficulty curve of facial animations. To ease the player into this system, early cases in patrol and traffic have witnesses and suspects with extremely unsubtle facial animations. But as the game goes on, and the cases become more insidious and larger scale, sniffing out liars becomes a constantly escalating challenge, in the same way gunfights might be in a first-person shooter or group encounters in an RPG. But more challenging than anything is distinguishing between lie and doubt. Because you need evidence to accuse a suspect of lying, it can be tricky to determine which piece of evidence fits your line of questioning. You have to pay very, very close attention to context clues, and even then it can still be vague, depending on the evidence descriptions in your notebook. Worse is that the phrasing for suspect responses can be ambiguous, and accusing them of lying will sometimes open up a whole new angle to the conversation that makes determining your answer much more clear. Only if you aren't going to proceed, then you have to back out of lying, which is always accompanied by the same 2 or 3 cringe-inducing, meek, awkward responses from Cole, after he flew into a psychotic, destructive rage on them just a moment ago.
Shut your fucking mouth! He was a better man than you'll ever know. You say one more word about him and I will blow your fucking head off!
You finally lost it, partner.
Unfortunately, as much of a success as the interrogations are, and they really truly are, it is far from perfect, as to be expected with a pioneering, complex system like this. The balance of interrogations is extremely delicate, one that the game unfortunately often oversteps. Sometimes it can require the player to make some pretty big leaps of logic and assumptions that they don't have any concrete evidence to prove. In the case The Driver's Seat, the first case of the traffic desk, Cole is interrogating Mrs. Black, wife to Adrian, the missing person and main interest of the case. Cole finds a secret note behind a photograph in Adrian's room from someone named Nicole, most likely Adrian's mistress. When Cole asks Mrs. Black about the photo, she claims to know nothing about the photo and is obviously lying. But because Cole has no direct evidence to claim that she knows about the secret message behind the photo, the correct answer would certainly be doubt, right? Actually, it's a lie, and the secret message is the evidence needed to prove it. But how is the player supposed to know Mrs. Black has seen the secret message behind this photo? You don't, you just have to assume that she has. She's lying about it for a reason, but there is a multitude of reasons she could be lying about it, without actually having seen it. Maybe she has suspicions of a secret note and doesn't want to actually know what it says. The game even does the exact same thing later in the same case when you are interrogating Frank Morgan. He denies that he was at the rail yard with the car covered in blood, and your proof that he was there is a receipt for a live pig with his name on it. Are you kidding me? That's like being arrested for murder because you dropped a receipt for your groceries in a parking lot and the wind carried it over to a crime scene. That doesn't prove anything. Who's to say that Adrian didn't get the receipt before and just left it in his car? What this means is that you can't overlook or second guess your evidence in your notebook. If you have evidence loosely connecting a suspect to a line of questioning that they deny, chances are it is the right answer regardless if it really makes sense when you actually think about it. And this leads into the other major problem with the system, in that it treats these interrogations like a test with clear right and wrong answers. In certain situations, the game does actually allow multiple right answers, but only occasionally, and I'd argue that the correct evidence for catching a suspect in a lie is actually wrong, or at least not explained well enough in a couple of cases. It creates this constant anxiety of doubting the game to recognize your line of thinking when prioritizing its own above all else. The game does have a fallback if you fail a certain number of questions where you have to perform extra objectives, like tailing a suspect to gather critical information. But the easier answer would have been to provide a spectrum of right answers instead of 1 or 2 objectively right. Now, this wouldn't work in every scenario, but if the player chooses a piece of evidence that the game recognizes as loosely connected, maybe reward the player with half a point or something, and then add extra questions later for the player to recover that critical information that they missed. A more flexible, less rigid interrogation system would go a long way to relieving frustration, especially when the game can be a bit ambiguous about what it really wants from the player at times. When the interrogation system is at its absolute best, All of this will seem petty and frantically grasping, because when it works, it's just about the most thrilling interactive dialogue that you'll find in any game. Towards the end of a couple of LA Noire's more ethically ambiguous cases, you are presented with choices so nerve-wracking and tense that all the little annoyances just dissolve away. When you are presented with multiple suspects, neither of which will fully confess or clear up inconsistent details in your case, and the game fully trusts you as the player to make the decision, you are holding these men's lives in your hands. Nobody who ends up in the interrogation room could be classified as a good person, but what happens if you charge the wrong person and the real suspect is free to kill again? While the system as a whole is filled with annoyances, it doesn't always work the way it's supposed to due to the carefully orchestrated ballet of acting, writing, and setup from the developers. It's moments like this that transcend its own flaws. LA Noire truly is peerless when it comes to its interrogations. It has successfully created a video game in the traditional sense, not a walking simulator or an adventure game with window dressing detective mechanics, but a true game out of a genre and mechanics that are anything but traditional. LA Noire follows the same formula for its entire duration. Get called to a crime scene, investigate, interview witnesses, follow the evidence, and then charge a suspect. And this is an extremely long game, easily 25 to 30 hours with the DLC. The risk of becoming monotonous is high, and while it does fall into that trap occasionally, it does a wonderful job of changing up the theming of cases with its 4 separate desks throughout the game. Well, technically 5 if you count Patrol, but this is basically just the tutorial. Traffic is the first desk Cole is sent to after being promoted out of Patrol, and while on the surface it seems like it would be the most mundane, solving traffic accidents doesn't exactly seem thrilling. It actually ends up being one of the better desks in the game due to its investigations heavily focusing on deceptive schemes like insurance fraud and ploys by cheating husbands. Homicide is supposed to be the top assignment for detectives and should be, by all reason, the best desk in the game. And in some ways it definitely is. It's absolutely the game's mechanical peak, with fully detailed crime scene investigation, more thrilling interrogations, and in the last case, actual open-world puzzle solving. But its overarching serial killer plotline ends up ringing most of your efforts hollow and invalidates all of your charged suspects throughout the desk. None of the people Phelps has charged and arrested for these murders are responsible, and while they are all guilty of something, there's a subtle feeling that you are charging the wrong people throughout the desk. Charging your suspect is incredibly satisfying in this game. It truly does feel like your boots on the ground, your blood and sweat, and your instinct are responsible. Taking away that feeling for the entire homicide desk is the wrong move. The idea of a serial killer is fantastic, and the one they've developed here is actually pretty interesting for being the fictional version of the real-life unknown killer of the Black Dahlia. For those unaware, the Black Dahlia is one of the most famous unsolved cases in American history, shocking and mystifying the nation with its brutality, but more than anything, its thoughts and intentions. A woman named Elizabeth Short was found in an empty lot in Los Angeles, cut in half at the waist, completely drained of blood, cut from the corners of her mouth to her ears, and posed in a carefully thought out position. This was in 1947. At this point, the Cleveland torso murderer had already had his tear. Same for the axe murder of New Orleans, but even those murders seemed casual compared to this. The torso murderer would dismember his victims, then dump them haphazardly. The axe murderer would bludgeon his victims in their beds, but this ritualistic display of a body out in the open was something that captivated the nation's attention for months. Casting the serial killer as a continuation of this murder makes it historically interesting as well, which does a lot to enhance the plotline. The final case of the desk is one of the best in the game, despite having no suspects to question. It focuses entirely on this killer and his provenance in taunting the police with clues. He leads Phelps on a chase around the whole city with snippets from Mary Shelley that the player has to connect to prominent locations on the map all by themselves. No real handholding from the game. It's still shocking to me in a game with a budget like this. It's the game's mechanical peak, taking detective work and expanding it to an entire city scavenger hunt with no guidance from the game at all. Adding even more to the general unsatisfying feeling of the homicide desk is the serial killer's final identity. He is the half-brother of a highly elected official, and the case cannot be made public to avoid embarrassment by proxy for this unknown senator or congressman. Cole corners him in a church, and after a lengthy chase through the underground, kills him. It's an enormous relief. All of those false convictions can be overturned, and wrongs can be made right again. Well, word comes down to scrub all traces of the serial killer's true identity and to release the falsely convicted suspects quietly over a longer, untraceable period. No commendations, no public celebrations can be made. Even at the very end, you never manage to get a suspect cleanly in homicide. It's an odd choice for a game so enthusiastic about the procedures of detective work. After Cole unceremoniously solves the serial killer, he's promoted to Advice, which I would argue is the best of the 4 desks in the game. For the first time, Cole's cases extend to much larger organized crime, all in the wake of a morphine heist. It's actually still inferior to Homicide in terms of its mechanics. It's all a little more streamlined, but the theme and the plot of each case is significantly more captivating in its scale and its twists and turns. Cases like the Black Caesar and the DLC case, The Naked City, are by far the longest and most challenging in the game, with both hardened career criminals for interrogations in the former, and much harder to read characters with complicated motivations in the latter. And beyond its grander scale, it has variety to go along with it. Cases like The Setup and Manifest Destiny offer a total change in pace and subject matter than most of the other cases. The Setup is much more humble, much more relatable than most, with Cole tasked with tracking down a boxer mixed up in a scheme with the organized crime figures in the city. It plays totally differently than any of the other cases in the game, with much more emphasis put on tailing and brief bursts of action. And Manifest Destiny almost entirely throws out the format the game has stringently followed up until this point, for a climax involving a war between the former soldiers who stole and distributed morphine from plundered military supplies, and Mickey Cohen's goons out in the streets. Next to the Quarter Moon murders, this case has the least amount of detective work in the whole game, but it's a change of pace that really works and brings some excitement and urgency that the game often lacks. The final desk of the game is a divisive one, understandably so, because for reasons I'll get into later, Cole is demoted instead of promoted for the first time in the game to Arson. It's where the undesirables in the department go for a reason. Arsons are very rarely ever solved. Fire destroys all the evidence, and those who committed the act can be a whole state away by the time the police will ever get involved. The detective work is downplayed to a much lesser degree, still not on the level of the Quarter Moon murders or Manifest Destiny, but instead of just for one climactic case, it's for the majority of the entire desk. It's definitely not apparent at first, as its opening case, the Gas Man, is one of the best in the game, bringing back for the first time since Homicide an unclear multi-suspect investigation with no clear guidance on who to charge. But ultimately, Arson ends up being much more about wrapping up the overarching plot than it is about individual cases. It's a change of pace that is welcome, given at this point the fatigue of the detective mechanics is probably setting in, but also can be obnoxious at times due to the narrative impeding case progress and an overabundance of shootouts and car chases, more so than any other desk. This is LA Noire's biggest issue, more so than the inconsistencies in procedure, more so than the inadequacies of its innovative interrogation system, more so than its predominantly repetitive structure. LA Noire is a pioneer in many aspects, but it's not able to fully escape the conventions and expectations attached to it. It's published by Rockstar and was developed in collaboration with 2 of Rockstar's studios. Because of its association with this publisher and their massively popular series Grand Theft Auto, the question that haunted the game up to and after its release was, is it like Grand Theft Auto but in the 1940s? I even have anecdotal evidence, as I firmly remember a conversation I had when I actually bought the game. This was back when I was in high school and using an Xbox 360. The guy at the checkout counter at my local GameStop actually asked me, "This is like that new Grand Theft Auto game, right?" As he pulls literally the one and only copy in stock out of a box stuffed to the top with crusty used controllers, like they never expected anyone to actually buy the thing. LA Noire had a crisis of identity in terms of public perception. The game sold so poorly compared to its massive budget that the studio was disbanded after releasing its one and only game. And this crisis of perception is still evident in the actual design of the game itself with its combat sections. The vast majority of the shooting in the game makes painfully frivolous feel like an understatement. Lots of action games have shooting sequences that feel unimportant, but I've never played another game in my life like this that highlights just how pointless and nonsensical third-person cover-based shooting can be in a narrative-driven game. LA Noire is a game that can make the most mundane things so gripping. The simple act of revelation, of understanding a piece of evidence's importance to the overall case, is a rush of adrenaline 10 times that of shooting 10 dudes in a warehouse before the next cutscene starts. Yet LA Noire features more combat than it ever should have, although it should be noted still nowhere near as much as a conventional action game. It tips the scale just barely into disproportionality, but it absolutely does not dominate the experience. Instead, it serves as an occasional roadblock, blocking the path of its genuinely novel detective mechanics. But it stands out as being uniquely grating and incongruous, not just because of its prominence, but its mediocrity of mechanics and the general lack of care in its design. Grand Theft Auto was never a good shooter to begin with, and LA Noire somehow feels worse than any of the modern GTA games, with an even stickier cover system, and a lock-on aiming system that is even more unwieldy and unsatisfying. There isn't even an ammo counter or any kind of heads-up display besides a crosshair, and it doesn't seem like a deliberate choice like it's Ranger Hardcore in Metro or anything. I honestly think the developers just thought it didn't matter because of how unremarkable the shooting already is. There isn't any care taken to make the combat unique to the game. Maybe due to the much shorter skirmishes, have death come from a single shot and give the player a realistic ammo count. One magazine or two that a detective would actually carry with them. Scale down the scope of combat sequences to make sure this would not be unfair, and you'd have something that at the very least would be unique. Combat in a narrative-driven detective game is not inherently a bad thing. There's a couple sequences in this game, while mediocre mechanically, elevate the presentation and excitement of the story considerably, but it's mostly nothing but frivolous, passionless fluff, added solely for the sake of being able to advertise it on the back of the box, and establish a mechanical lineage from Grand Theft Auto.
Come to Los Angeles. The sun shines bright, the beaches are wide and inviting, and the orange grove stretches far as the eye can see. There are jobs aplenty, and land is cheap.
LA Noire's narrative is a lovingly attributed blend of a handful of cinematic influences, but most prominently, Roland Polanski's 1974 film Chinatown and Curtis Hanson's 1997 film LA Confidential. Those films in particular are responsible for taking noir out of the dark city, the rain and the brooding night, and into bright and sunny California, while still maintaining the spirit of noir, the corruption of the city and the scrappy outsider hero. I'll get into the specifics of these influences a little bit later, but know that their influence is pervasive in the plot and characters in the game. That's not to say that LA Noire is thoroughly unoriginal, but that it wears its influences on its sleeve. Instead, LA Noire blazes its own trail most prominently with its player character, Cole Phelps. I've never really seen another character like this in a noir story. Noir is famous for flawed protagonists who are essentially bad people being used unwittingly or wittingly to do good things. Alcoholism, cynicism, infidelity, hot-tempered, and violent are all character traits you'll find in noir protagonists. Cole Phelps only possesses one of these, and it might not be the one you think. Phelps is a rare, mostly unlikable video game protagonist, and not in the usual way, because his unlikability doesn't stem from being psychopathic or being gleeful in violence, but from his ambition. Ambition, usually being a universally positive and attractive trait in a person, instead is inverted and twisted inside Cole. It's a blind, unchecked, ruthless ambition that doesn't even consider slowing down for a second to consider how much carnage it might cause to others. Throughout the game, you'll see flashbacks to Cole's time in the war, and this ends up becoming hugely significant towards the end of the game. in giving background to much of the important characters who have largely been off screen for the majority of the game, but also in showing that even as much of an insufferably perfect golden boy Cole is in the present time, he was even worse during his time in the military. Cole was a terrible commander, impulsive with no common sense or flexibility, refusing to heed the words of anyone under his command and stringently doing everything by the book, even when the rules of the book have already been thrown out the window. Cole gets his entire squad killed and then hides among the blood and guts of the men under his command before he's rescued by another squad. He's given the Silver Star and commended for it. Cole learns nothing. His final act before being shipped home from the war is his worst, mistakenly burning a cave full of civilians. Cole is shot by one of his own men and then shipped home, and you can't help but think it justified. Cole was an awful commander, and in all respects, a bad person who did wrong by his men and ended up getting ahead for it. The Cole we play as in the game hasn't changed a ton in his attitude or the way he does things, but you can tell whenever the topic of conversation shifts to the war, or whenever he interacts with someone who knew him from the war, he's evasive and seems to carry a fair amount of shame. It's maybe his only redeeming quality. Well, that and Cole's skills as a detective that make determining his worth as a character considerably more complicated. As a detective, not a commander, Cole is incredibly successful and effective. His bosses love him for it, and his partners, although still visibly irritated by his personality and his ambition, come to respect him for just how good of a caseman he ends up becoming. All the things that make Cole a good detective, his ambition, his willingness to embrace any possibility, his understanding and respect of his adversaries are things that make him an abrasive and dangerous person to anyone in his path. The character I'm reminded of the most, and this may seem an odd comparison at first, is Jimmy McNulty from The Wire. In cadence, appearance, and sobriety, the two couldn't be more different. McNulty is vulgar, disheveled, and has a much more liberal approach to alcohol, yet McNulty shares the same unstoppable will as Phelps. Throughout The Wire's 5 seasons, McNulty burns every bridge, angers everyone close to him, brings careers to the brink of extinction, and yet carries no guilt for it, because all that matters to him is the case. Phelps is one and the same. He can be incredibly likable and admirable for his accomplishments, but caustic to anyone who stands in his way. The more obvious example would be Exley from LA Confidential, considering it's the character Team Bondi obviously took the most inspiration from. But Exley and Cole have one stark difference. Exley actually grows and changes. By the end of LA Confidential, Exley scales back his ambition and his careerism to chase a case that actually matters, and willingly puts his own career in jeopardy to right a wrong. It's incredibly satisfying as character arcs go. Not because Exley loses everything that made him a distinct character, but that he learns to channel his ambition towards doing actual good things instead of singularly for personal gain. Unfortunately, Cole never really learns anything like this. He is the same character more or less at the end than he is at the beginning. He never embraces or even recognizes his own flaws and remains ignorant to the very end. When Cole is in his element, working a crime scene or interrogating a suspect, it's really hard to take fault with him. He's an excellent officer. It's an actual human conversation that Cole's inner faults rear their ugly head. Nobody brings out this dynamic more than Phelps' partners, who run the gamut from two-faced sleazebags to drunken cynics. They're not exactly good people either, maybe with the exception of Cole's final partner, Biggs, but what they are is a lot more relatable and honest in their flaws. Their banter with Cole exposes his ambition for what it really is: dangerous. Rusty Galloway, Phelps' partner in Homicide, is probably the most direct opposite of a person to Cole in the whole game, because he's completely unambitious and unwilling to consider scenarios he considers uncommon and unlikely after a long career in Homicide. He's wrong, at least in his time with Cole, since he remains firmly convinced of his convictions all the way up until the point where it remains impossible to consider them valid. Rusty just plain isn't as good of a detective as Cole, but his conversations with Cole are fascinating because of their totally opposite personality traits and beliefs. On the surface, Rusty is crass, ignorant, and even sexist. Granted, this is the 1940s, while Cole's ideas are a lot more contemporary, making him wildly progressive for the time. He has respect for women. He has respect for his adversaries. He has sympathy for those who deserve it. Everything is telling me I'm supposed to be on Cole's side. but Cole's baggage and negative traits always cloud everything that make him a worthwhile person. I found myself agreeing with Rusty more than Cole, even though I disagree ideologically. Roy Earl, Cole's partner in Vice, on the surface would seem to be even more opposite as a person to Cole than Galloway would be, because he's outwardly corrupt, racist, sexist, and belligerent, even extremely for the time. But in fact, they share a lot of the same traits. Roy is one of Cole's most supportive partners and embraces his drive and his ambition more than any other. Galloway and Bukowski, Cole's partners in Traffic, even though they are much better people than Roy, aren't as quick to embrace Cole's skills as a detective. He's also extremely good at his job when he wants to be. He knows almost every criminal in the city on a first-name basis, and that gives him and Cole an entrance to question suspects who would be out of reach with any other partner. Roy, like Cole, is an excellent detective, and a bad person. Only his negative qualities are much more naked and explicit than Cole. He has absolutely zero empathy for anyone in the game. He's outwardly cruel and callous. Cole has caused immense suffering to those around him in his past, but it was all out of a misguided attempt to be good. He didn't intend to cause harm to anyone in his squad. And during his time as a detective, Cole shows empathy and understanding to those who deserve it, showing sympathy for the people who have been murdered, letting off those involved in the case who are mostly innocent or hapless. As difficult as it can be at times to swallow all the things Cole's influence has turned to ash, his interactions with Roy proves that he's a good person underneath it all. Roy is like Cole if all of his morality was stripped right out of him. It's his incompetence and his ambition that turn his good intentions sour. Ironically, Cole's capacity for kindness and empathy is what gets him in trouble towards the end of the game. It's Noire. The officials at the top are thoroughly compromised and corrupt. The chief of police, the mayor, the DA, all of them are embroiled in a scandal in the newspapers when Roy Earl walks in brandishing his trademark smirk with an enticing story. A war hero and a well-respected cop has let his country and his wife down by sleeping with a German junkie whore, as Roy puts it. That man is Cole Phelps. Throughout the game, you'll get extremely brief glimpses of Cole being at first subtly, and then later obviously entranced by a jazz singer in a club that Roy introduces him to named Elsa. The first couple times you see it, it's kind of a, huh? Well, that was a weird moment, but towards the end of the game, Cole's increasing presence in the Blue Room makes it more and more obvious. Eventually, you as the player perform your first action as Cole off the job, when he tails Elsa to her apartment in the middle of the night. But instead of Elsa opening up the door confused, irritated at this strange man knocking on her door in the middle of the night, she opens the door in her nightgown, motioning Cole inside. Roy is watching from outside. He now has everything he needs to get Cole off his back and advance his own career in the process. Why would Roy go to all this trouble? Because of one of Cole's rare acts of kindness, by letting a boxer who failed to throw a match for a payoff go out of sympathy for his situation. Roy was one of those heavily riding on the fight to go as planned and lost a ton of money in the betrayal. Roy personally asked for Cole as a partner in Vice because he saw how quickly he rose through the department, and was naive enough to think that Cole was someone he could control and use for his own personal gain. Cole's reasoning for it doesn't make a lot of sense, which gives the impression that it was decided ahead of time for the plot to work, instead of being a natural development for the character. But regardless, it kicks off the end of Cole's ascent through the LAPD and the beginning of the end for the game. Cole is demoted for the first time to Arson. His name is Dirt. Keep in mind, this is the 1940s when adultery was an actual enforceable crime. Everyone who once respected him now struggles to hold their tongue at his misdeeds. During the earlier portions of the game, you'll hear ambient dialogue about the populace's opinion on Phelps. Hey, it's that guy from the papers, they'll say. They say he's an honest cop. Now, even the city coroner chides Cole for his infidelity. Cole is a golden boy no more. And it's in Arson that Cole meets his last and best partner of the game, Herschel Biggs. Biggs is a mirror of Phelps. He's essentially what Cole would turn into if the glory no longer mattered for him. He's in Arson for a similar reason to Phelps. He's a social basket case who up until now refused to work with a partner. So here's this weary, old, worn-down former Marine with a voice like sandpaper, stuck in the most undesired and least respected hole in the department, and now he's forced to work with the now-tarnished golden boy whose name he kept seeing in the papers. Biggs hates his guts. One of the very first things Cole says to him is how he's going to make a huge case and rub the department's nose in it. He thinks Cole just wants to be a hero again, and while there is an element of truth in it, Biggs eventually comes to respect him for the same reason that all of his other partners once did. Cole is just a damn good detective and points the case in all the right directions. Their partnership is easily the most interesting out of the four, as Biggs shares something with Cole that no other partner has: battlefield experience. Biggs was a Marine in World War I and experiences a genuine PTSD moment after witnessing a monstrous house fire of a family showing signs of post-mortem ritualistic movement. He relents and offers his full support in Cole's investigation, but not for glory, not for medals, not for citations, but to kill this guy, out of respect for what he saw on the battlefield. Two detectives, both undesirables, both working to solve a serial arsonist for particularly unheroic and selfish reasons. It's an odd way to end the game, but a remarkably compelling and unique one. Cole being demoted isn't the only thing responsible for Arson being the most divisive desk in the game, though. It also changes up the player character temporarily for the first and only time in the game to Jack Kelso, another Marine who knew Cole from the war, now working as an insurance investigator for California Fire and Life. Cole and Biggs run up against the wall when they start to investigate Leland Monroe, president of the Suburban Redevelopment Fund and a thoroughly popular and respected figure in the upper ranks of the police department due to his significant financial contributions. Cole realizes that as police, and even worse than that, particularly unpopular police, his hands are tied. He can't investigate the full breadth of the case, so he gets Jack Kelso to handle this angle for him, unwittingly by sending Elsa to put him on the case. Cole has racked up a substantial amount of enemies during his time with the Marines and now on the police force as well, but nobody hates Cole more than Jack Kelso, who experienced firsthand Cole's destructive nature as a commander and was the one to take charge in the aftermath of Cole's final act as a soldier, the burning of the civilian cave. Playing as Jack, although identical to playing as Cole mechanically, is a switch that works surprisingly well narratively. Jack is well-intentioned, heroic, calm under pressure. He's everything that Cole isn't, and it creates a stark contrast of the man we've been playing up until this point. This gap widening even further when LA Noire has its ripped straight from the silver screen moment, when Cole and Jack decide to reconcile their differences and work together in tackling the full breadth of corruption the two of them are beginning to uncover. It is a scene that is a point-for-point reference to LA Confidential, where the two leads realize that they are being played for fools by the corrupt police captain and decide to work together finally for the finale of the film.
The night Al made you. You want to tear all that down?
With a wrecking ball. You want to help me swing it?
It's not done quite as well here. You don't get nearly as many scenes of Cole and Jack together to demonstrate their vicious rivalry, but it still has that same feeling of desperate measures to defeat a common enemy. Unfortunately though, it totally drops the ball in that you never get the two actually working the case together, instead relegated to their own individual work on the case. The best scenes of LA Confidential is towards the end, when the whole scale of corruption the lead detectives have been slowly piecing together is revealed, and when petty differences are solved. There's an incredibly satisfying scene where the two former rivals throw out all pretenses of being honest cops and storm the dirty DA's office for information in a thrilling, climactic shootout for the finale. LA Noire's conclusion is jumbled and misfitting by comparison. Jack does almost all the legwork in the last few hours, storming Leland Monroe's guarded mansion with a squad of former Marines, and getting the whole story in a matter of minutes. Leland Monroe, along with Dr. Fontaine, a particularly insidious figure featured in many of the game's past, future, and adjacent timeline newspaper sequences, have set up a scheme to build cheap matchstick houses for GIs and then burn them for the insurance money. They did it with the help of other top figures in the city, the mayor, the DA, and the chief of police. The whole entire top echelon is poisoned. So the case is made, all the information laid bare, and plenty of evidence at Leland's residence to bring the whole thing home. But there's a problem. The arsonist hired to do the dirty work has gone rogue, murdered Fontaine, and kidnapped Elsa. As a final boss of sorts, the arsonist is a rather remarkably sad and tragic figure, bringing Cole's past mistakes front and center. It's the same Marine responsible for burning the civilian cave under orders from back in the war, Ira Hogaboom. It nearly broke him psychologically. He went to Fontaine for help and shortly after was sent to burn the empty houses for the insurance scheme. Fontaine said that it would help him face his past and that it would give him new meaning and purpose. Only there was a mistake. One of the houses wasn't empty. Experiencing the guilt again from people on the other side of his flamethrower finally broke him. He was the one responsible for arranging the family in a ritualistic manner, not out of demented pleasure but out of penance. Now used by those above him twice, both in the war and back home, he couldn't bear being an instrument of hellfire anymore and began to rationalize his actions as helping those he killed by helping them attain a higher existence. He kills Fontaine and kidnaps Elsa, coincidentally as she happened to be in the room confronting Fontaine with his misdeeds at the time. So the final mission of the game is Jack and Cole in pursuit of Ira and Elsa, both to bring in the final piece of the case and for Cole to save the only person left in his life that doesn't despise him. It's odd as finales go. For 90% of its duration, LA Noire is a calculated, measured, consistent game about the rigorous procedures of police work. Occasionally it tosses that aside for some variety, but this finale is about as misfitting and jarring as any finale that I've ever seen in a game. Zero police work, all action. In fact, for the final chunk of the game, the player is in Jack's shoes again, so we don't even get to spend any time with our protagonist that we've been playing as for the last 30 hours. It's an extended combat sequence in a sewer. Yeah, I'm serious. The worst level design trope is the final mission of the entire game. Truth be told, it's an above average sewer, mostly because of its relatively short length, but still pretty damn uninspired. Considerably more so because it's the finale of the game. There's no evidence to collect, no interrogations, no real challenge beyond surviving the janky, unsatisfying shooting mechanics with larger groups of enemies all at once. All of this wholesale tossing of the detective work the game has spent all this time teaching you comes to nothing. The finale is singularly interested in solving the overarching narrative of Cole and his Marines than it is about testing the player mechanically like a traditional video game would have. And it's a bit of tradition I think would have been wise to follow. They were overwhelmingly successful at making traditional video game mechanics out of detective work, but they don't carry through that same ambition and energy to the end of the game. It's an odd place to end the game mechanically, and even the narrative put to the expense of everything else isn't able to escape the same feeling. Jack and Cole catch up to Ira, who in the end doesn't want to fight. He recognizes both of them and is ready to go. Being reunited with his former squad brings him the peace and closure he's been so desperately in search of ever since he was sent into that cave back in Okinawa. It's sympathetic and poignant. Difficult to pull off with a character with such limited screen time, and yet no sympathy is able to be drawn from our hero. There's never that eureka moment where Cole realizes that his unchecked ambition, although being the cause for significant progress in his career, both in the military and the police, has left a trail of ruin behind him. Hogaboom is the central mural of that ruin. He's a monster of Cole's own creation. Cole still wants to take Hogaboom in at the end and only concedes once Jack steps in and tells Cole and Elsa to flee. To the very end, Cole never accepts responsibility. Then, as Cole, Jack, and Elsa are escaping the sewer, Cole is awkwardly swept away by the rising current.
Jump, Cole! Jump for it!
That's the end to our hero in a 30-hour detective odyssey. It's jarring, it doesn't resolve anything with the character, and it feels like it takes place 10 hours too late, with the game already having reached its mechanical peak hours and hours earlier. I have a really hard time figuring out what the developers' intentions were with this ending. Is it a bittersweet sacrifice of a man finally achieving redemption? Or is it a classically downbeat noir ending where the corruption of the city officials is unstoppable as our heroes fail to stop them? I've come to the conclusion that it's trying to be both at once, very, very awkwardly. In the final scene of the game, Cole's real friends and pretend friends are gathered for the funeral while Roy Earl stands on stage giving his final remarks. While some of the men responsible for the fires have been stopped, the mayor, the chief of police, and Roy Earl all get away with it. They put the blame fully on Dr. Fontaine and Leland Monroe, and the ambitious DA, supposedly eager to clean up corruption, makes a deal with the chief to further his own career. Nothing is really achieved, which would be appropriate as a noir ending, but it feels so out of place in this game, which has more cinematic influences from LA Confidential than it does Chinatown. LA Noire does so much so right, but it burns itself out too quick and ends on a jumbled, anticlimactic note. But it's one of the few games that makes it really difficult to hold most of its flaws against it because it's a pioneer. This is the first ever attempt made at creating a game like this at this scale. Problems are bound to happen as the formula is unrefined and without comparison. There's not many developers brave enough to create a whole genre in the AAA space, and it's because of games like this that suffer a massive commercial failure that it might never happen again. LA Noire was supposed to be the beginning of an exciting new genre, one that would eventually grow to become just as ubiquitous and well-respected as other subgenres of open-world games. But it wasn't to be. Team Bondi, the developer, shortly after LA Noire's release, was closed down and liquidated. Like its own protagonist, the developer's ambitions were perhaps greater than they were capable of achieving without losses along the way. LA Noire was reported to have sold around 5 million copies shortly after its release, which is nothing to scoff at. But LA Noire, when it released, was one of the most expensive video games ever to develop, with a development and marketing budget of more than $50 million. Compared to other Rockstar properties at the time, its sales are not even in the same stratosphere. GTA 4 sold somewhere around 20 million copies, and even though it cost twice as much to make, it sold 4 times as many copies. The sales, considering the budget and expectations of the publisher, unfortunately were not very impressive. There was also a string of internal development office politics that I don't want to get into detail with. Let's just say that the development and aftermath of LA Noire was rocky, and it's unfortunately what killed the studio. Since then, the studio was briefly reinvigorated and working on a game called Whore of the Orient, a spiritual successor to LA Noire set in 1936 Shanghai. Like LA Noire before it, it was going to pioneer a new setting, never really seen before in a AAA game, and it was going to expand and refine the kind of mechanics that we saw in LA Noire. But unfortunately, it was cancelled, and the former LA Noire developers' work may never see the light of day. LA Noire's critical reception didn't help either, with publications at the time of its release that didn't really know what to make of LA Noire, with a relatively wishy-washy reception, and even though it was popular enough to end up on something like South Park, it was at the expense of its interrogation system.
Well, come on, we're playing LA Noire! That shitty game? Who plays video games to listen to a bunch of characters talk and press the X button?
I don't want to say that it was malign, but it was confusing to much of the public and the game's press at the time. Its influence hasn't really been felt at all in its detective mechanics, which I haven't seen directly influenced or attributed in any other game. It's been largely forgotten. The one area where it has remained influential is its motion capture technology, which almost every AAA game of the last few years has used a similar version of, gradually evolving and improving the technology to the point where it is today. LA Noire is an enigma. It's one of the most exciting, novel, and groundbreaking games released in the past few years, but one that isn't as well respected or influential as it deserves. Genre-creating, or at least genre-redefining games are usually critical darlings due to their novelty, but I never see this game show up on best of lists or hardly see it mentioned at all in the popular conscience. For a game as unique as this, as compelling and innovative and surprising and all its trailblazing and daring accomplishments, it's such a shame that this is the way it and its creators have ended up. LA Noire is the detective game that we deserve, but evidently not the one that we need right now.
Well, I love the chase till the minute I win it. A beautiful face till there is love for me in it. Give me your heart and baby I'll bill it, 'cause I always kill the things I like.